xenophobia are spread on social media, who are some of the candidates who are spreading it, as in why they're doing so and what do they hope to achieve. And the event will be in two parts. So the first part will have a panel discussion, and it is my honor to introduce Jean Leroux, who is Digital Forensic Research Laboratory, to talk about some of the research that they've done on people or bots like Lerato Pillay. Chanel van der Berg is a senior researcher of equality at the South African Human Rights Commission. And obviously, as you know, their core mandate is to deal with key rights violations around racism and xenophobia, amongst other things. And Stuart Jones is from the Center for Analytical Behavior Change. And they are partners with Media Monitoring Africa on doing some really great work around xenophobic networks. Just for me, what has been interesting about this particular issue, naturally, what we have seen recently is that hashtag SARS must rise. And this has been around the sentiments coming from some quarters in South Africa about what they were responding to the SARS violations, to the abuse by the special armed robbery squad in Nigeria and the atrocities that they have been alleged to commit. But some pockets in South Africa decided to use a hashtag to spew xenophobic sentiment. We know another thing that has been trending, Senegal, events in Senegal have given rise to very many racist events, rhetoric from people within the farming community, within political parties. So for me, this is quite interesting, a discussion. And just to let you know that there is a second part of this discussion. So later on, we'll have Dario Miller from Weber Wenzel, who's going to give us all a beginner's guide to hate speech. The purpose of this will be to help us understand the recent constitutional court cases and judgments, and when does racism and xenophobia become hate speech. So without saying it too much, let's get straight into it. And I think we should start by understanding whether or not we're being overwhelmed by racism and xenophobia. Are we framing the discussions around what's going on well? As in, are we seeking to do any good with how we are framing these discussions? So let me start with you, Stuart. What have you found?
Yeah, it's difficult to say. You know, the online world, of course, is very different to the real world, in inverted commas. The narratives here are clearly manipulated and amplified. You know, the Put South Africans First hashtag first appeared on the 27th of April on Freedom Day and went literally from naught on the 26th of April to 16,000 mentions on the 27th, to show how coordinated a campaign it has been. And it has grown the xenophobic discourse on social media in South Africa almost 100-fold, from about 250 posts a day up to at times 25,000 posts a day. Now, in the grander scheme of social media in South Africa, that's not necessarily that big. But it represents not only a really big growth in xenophobia on social media, but also the nature of it has changed over time and has hardened as time has gone on. And clearly that's part of the kind of ongoing campaign. So at the moment, the network is talking about cleaning South Africa, which of course is genocidal kind of links. And it's interesting that you mentioned Senegal and SARS, not our revenue services, and the impact of those, because this network is constantly reaching its tentacles out into different conversations. And interestingly, farm murders in Senegal was one of them. And wherever they can latch onto a narrative in which there are issues that scare people, and they are able ostensibly to make a link between that and foreign nationals, that's what they do. So their Senegal one, and here you see kind of young black xenophobic South Africans mixing with older white Afrikaans South Africans in the strangest of ways, in which the narrative is the farm murders are being committed by foreign nationals, which of course there's absolutely no evidence to suggest. But those are the kinds of things that they're doing all the time. So to say that we're overwhelmed would be overstating the issue. I think as a country, we have to accept that we are quite a xenophobic country. And a lot of people at best would be, I'm not xenophobic, but sort of people, which has happened to me when I've gone onto radio and TV a few times talking about this, and people that are doing my makeup or whatever it might be would be saying literally that, I'm not xenophobic, but. And so it's tapping into really, really deep-seated issues, systemic issues. It's blaming them on foreigners, and it is setting up a tinderbox kind of environment. You know, in social media activism, we talk about an instigating incident, which is something that galvanizes a movement into action, and it's that we're concerned about. You know, one instigating incident, a foreigner does something that they're able to latch onto, and this could well turn into kind of above the line violence pretty easily.
Sure, Stuart. Thank you so much for that. Very interesting. And I'd like to actually use Senegal as a springboard and come to you, Chanel, because obviously the issue of race, land have been very much intertwined. And it's interesting to hear what Stuart is talking about, those instigating incidents that he talks about and how they've been used to really whip up sentiment. So from the Human Rights Commission's perspective, those deep-seated systemic issues, how are they finding expression beyond what Stuart has said on social media? If people are already writing things like, is South Africa ready for the next xenophobic wave? Like Stuart says, it does basically imply that we are a xenophobic country, and obviously a racist country is something that's historically found.
All right, thank you very much. And also to Stuart before me and to Media Monitoring Africa for convening this very important session. So maybe just to start by saying the Human Rights Commission is an independent constitutional body to support constitutional democracy, and it has 3 mandates. So it's a protection mandate, a promotion mandate, and a monitoring and assessment mandate. And the Commission needs to address both racism and xenophobia through all the 3 of these mandates in order to really make progress towards a more socially cohesive society in South Africa. Now, as we all might be aware, South Africa remains the most unequal country in the world for which there is available data. And this severe or gross economic inequality is closely connected and interlinked with the horizontal inequality and discrimination we see manifest both physically and then on social media. So in terms of xenophobia, the Commission has over the years, of course, observed along with the rest of the country these spurts of xenophobic violence and egregious violence based on nationality. And so the Commission has convened various legal hearings to try and address more the systemic issues behind this. So we often read about politicians and other public officials expressing xenophobic sentiments, and this just kind of displays that xenophobia is deeply ingrained in our systems, whether it's healthcare systems or policing services. So it's deeply ingrained, and these hearings then try to focus on the role of police, on the role of government structures such as NAT joints and so forth, to try and get rid of these structural blockages to prevent the next spate of violence. And the latest hearing was as recently as February of this year. And that year it was an inquiry, and it also tried to focus on xenophobic violence in the truck driving industry specifically. And since that, we've seen it happen again. And at the same time, we see these expressions on social media. And when we had a 2018 hearing on xenophobia and xenophobic violence, the narrative was, and again with truck driving, is while non-nationals are taking our jobs, we're living in poverty, the majority of our country is living in poverty, and all the jobs and all the opportunities are going to non-nationals. So in the 2018 hearing, we also then had from informal settlements, we had civil society say, well, here are examples of best practice where non-nationals can help boost the economy in informal settlements and so forth. So to try to look at that positive element that is certainly brought by non-nationals in our country, since they build up the diversity that is South Africa. So in terms of racism then, every single year, the majority of complaints received by the Human Rights Commission is based on the alleged violation of the right to equality. And every year, the majority of those complaints are based on race. And that is then followed by other grounds for discrimination, such as disability, sexual orientation, and ethnic origin. So a lot of these complaints deal with face-to-face interactions and physical altercations, and then racial slurs are used or whatever the case might be. But certainly, yes, we take note of the surge in social media divisive speech. Now, the problem that comes is, and Dario will tell us more about the technicalities of hate speech, but we are mandated and we are guided by the Equality Act in what we can litigate and what kind of redress we can seek. And the Equality Act, it prohibits hate speech, it prohibits harassment, and it prohibits unfair discrimination, as well as the online and other publication of unfairly discriminatory materials. But, and as Dario would tell us, there's a lot of uncertainty. What are these legal standards? So when we see social media posts on Twitter and Facebook, and also comments on those posts, taken in isolation, those instances might not constitute a rights violation or a violation of one of the prohibitions in the Equality Act. But what we need to start looking at is whether, if we look at all these tweets and posts as a whole, whether we can just start discerning a pattern of harassment. And harassment is defined in the Equality Act as serious or persistent conduct on a prohibited ground like race or nationality that creates a hostile environment. So that is something worth exploring. But we can't only, as a commission, as a society, focus on legal remedies and legal accountability, because what is happening on social media is symptomatic of the struggles on the ground, the gross economic inequality that is causing fear, as Stuart mentioned, that is causing a feeling of territoriality over the scarce resources that are going around. So one also needs to pay attention to the promotion aspect of the mandate and of realizing human rights. So the rights we're looking at are rights to equality, human dignity, always. But then when it's online, we also have freedom of expression on the other side of the coin. And when we talk about xenophobia and the violence related to thereto, we are also talking about the right to freedom and security of the person. So how do we make this a promotional issue? Well, South Africa finally finalized the National Action Plan against racism, xenophobia, and related intolerance last year. It was a very long road since the Durban Conference Against Racism in the early 2000s. And the commission maintains its independent membership role on that committee. And the reason why it's good that the commission is independent is that it can both monitor gaps in the National Action Plan, and also in implementation by government of the National Action Plan. And of course, COVID has really set back the type of participatory engagements that were envisaged by government in promoting social cohesion. And then the other thing is that we're working on is, so the commission had a hearing in 2017 on racism and social media. And when we launched that report, stakeholders said we need self-regulation for online media. So the commission is in the process of looking at the development through participation of a social media charter that would be an effort at education and self-regulation, and would of course require the buy-in and promotion of everyone here today and broader society. So that's something to bear in mind. And then in terms of monitoring, the commission does comment on legislation and regulations that might further close the civic space for non-nationals and people discriminated against on the basis of race. And then also, of course, we eagerly awaiting the passage of the hate crimes and hate speech bill into law. And something that's very important also for divisive speech on social media is that when that bill comes into effect, it makes it a criminal law matter. So the Commission can't prosecute. We're not a prosecuting body, we're a Chapter 9 body. And that will also necessitate a different data collection system, and that is essential. We need to know on what basis discrimination and hate speech is taking place. And at the moment, we don't have the systems in place. So that's going to take a lot of resources, but it's very important. And then the other issue is the Commission struggles with tracing posters of divisive speech and needs, the assistance of law enforcement bodies for those purposes. And in terms of the hate crimes and hate speech bill, that responsibility will largely shift to SAPS. So that's also a promising development, but long overdue. So just to bear in mind then, as a summary, that all these different streams of inequality and forms of inequality as between each other in terms of words and expression and insults, and vertically in terms of this gross economic disparities, they're all intertwined and they all interact to create a culture of fear and of prejudice instead of a culture of unity and social cohesion. So it is very important to address this holistically. And then also just to bear in mind that social media can also be used for good and to really try and harness that potential. I mean, we might not have seen it, but I'm sure it's out there, harness that potential of using it in a positive way to identify and acknowledge our diversity, but to be very strong that diversity does not mean conflict. We can advance together to reach our constitutional goals. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Chanel. And just to let the participants know that we are going to have a question and answer session, so please use the Q&A function on the Zoom app to pose your question, and if you'd like to pose it to anyone specific, please say so as well. So Jean, let me come to you on the research that you've done. I mean, I think Chanel's also echoed that sentiment that people who do these things are exploitative and they're exploiting perennial problems, which obviously we've seen politicians who are supposed to be at the helm of resolving some of these issues deflect, and also that leading to incidents or sentiments of racism and xenophobia. But I also want to understand what the gender dynamics of some of these tweets that we're seeing, some of the discourse that people are using the online medium for. And we obviously are looking at South Africa, but if there are international trends that we should look out for that could inform us about our management thereof, or what makes us ripe as a country for these kind of harmful practices.
Yeah, thanks, Thabiso. I mean, this kind of disinformation campaign isn't something new. We've seen this way back in 2016 with the Gupta bots, where white monopoly capital was used as a lever to, promote a disinformation campaign that tried to absolve the Guptas of their role in corruption. I mean, it's basically the same playbook that's being applied again. It's a bit more refined this time around, but with most of these disinformation campaigns, emotive topics like race and nationalism, patriotism, all of these topics are very emotional, and that makes them very ripe for exploitation by disinformation networks. What this does is it triggers something within the readers of those posts that, as through research has shown, that people are more likely to share a post if it appeals to them on an emotional level instead of on a logical and a practical level. So what these disinformation actors do, and as was the case with the Put South Africa First and these xenophobic networks, they use that patriotism and that nationalism as a way to get the xenophobic message across. The moment that you start digging a little bit deeper into the nationalistic sentiments on the surface of this hashtag, you very quickly see that the sentiments underlying it has nothing to do with putting South Africans first, but instead with putting non-South Africans down. And that the way that they do this is through dishonest means. They take, for example, old newspaper articles from legitimate publications from 2017, 2016, even earlier, and then post those as fresh news if they mention foreign nationals committing crimes. Similarly, they would take photographs from, I think one example that I found was from a Nigerian hospital where people are lying on the ground. Then the Lerato Pillay account went and said that, well, look at how South African hospitals are so overbooked and under-resourced because of all the foreign nationals taking up our beds. South African women are sleeping on the ground, and this is the legacy that the ANC has left you. That's the kind of the tactic that they use to get this anti-foreign national topic across. What they do is they exploit the very real issues. We've got high unemployment. We've got a lot of joblessness. We've got high inequality. We've got a lack of service delivery, loads of promises that were made and not kept. And that discontent is harnessed by these hashtags and the topics. And the blame is then shifted not on the complex, the political problem facing us as a country and as a country trying to reach the goal of social cohesion. Instead, it's being blamed on foreign nationals, which is a lot simpler to process. It's a boogeyman and a scapegoat that's easy to identify and blame. And the unfortunate irony is that even if we were today to get rid of each and every single foreigner in South Africa, all of those issues would remain. Tomorrow, you'd still have a lot of unemployment. You'd still have a lot of inequality. There'd still be a lack of service delivery. So the issue isn't the presence of foreign nationals. It's the way that, we're being governed, the way that these issues are, these broader societal issues are being addressed. In terms of the way that these entities use that, if you use something that's racially divisive, something that's emotive, you are guaranteed to get a lot more clicks and a lot more views. As Stuart mentioned, the Put South Africa First hashtag first surfaced on I think it's the 27th of April. And it was in response to a tweet by the EFF leader Julius Malema that this post actually went out. So about 4 hours after that, politicians started using the same hashtag as well, kind of jumping in on that, on the traction that it was gaining. Herman Mashaba used the same hashtag about 4 hours after the Lerato Pillay account first tweeted it out. And since then, I just did a quick check this morning. There's been more than 1 million mentions of that hashtag from the 27th of April to date. And all of that, once you start looking at the topics and the replies underneath the hashtag, it's quite clear that this is part of a larger campaign trying to pin blame on foreign nationals. I think one of the issues that we've had so far is that there's no overt go out and commit crimes against foreign nationals. There's no call to action that's xenophobic. But over these past few months, there's been this consistent campaign to other and dehumanize and blame foreign nationals for a lot of broadly prevalent societal ills. And the result of that is that there's this increasing perception that foreign nationals are to blame for a lot of our ills, which is unfortunately, and as research has shown, not the case.
Thank you so much for that, Jean. So again, I'd like to say to those who are joining us, please use the Q&A section to pose your questions to it. I'll come back to you on this issue. I was asking Jean if what are the gender dynamics of some of these issues, and are they overt? I was actually just thinking about some of what Jean was saying, because sometimes people do use a lot of racial undertones, overtone. There's a subtext that is offensive and that is not as overt. So do we separate intention from disinformation? How do we navigate our way around understanding some of the messages that are put out there?
Yeah, generally we try and classify disinformation operations in 3 broad categories. The first one would be where they try and do it for some form of a commercial gain. That would be an example where a PR firm such as Bell Partnership steps in and runs a disinformation campaign for some commercial ends. Fake news websites also fall under that classification, as they use the traffic generated by the clickbait stories to generate ad revenue. The second classification is people just doing it for the fun. It's you usually see this in chain WhatsApps. A good example of this would be the claims circulating on WhatsApp earlier this year that the liquor stores would be closing again just after they opened. There's no financial or political gain to be had on that, but somebody did that and circulated that to see if they could have an impact on a broader society. And the third one would then be political campaigns. And we generally assume it's a political campaign if there's no apparent ways to monetize the campaign itself. In this case, the Put South Africa First hashtag doesn't have any way of making money off of the widely circulating hashtag. There are a few pockets within the networks that try and market and sell goods, but even they comprise a very small portion of the traffic around Put South Africa First, and it's not enough to be the aim and the objective of the campaign. So the only kind of logical conclusion you can draw is that this campaign has got some political background. And I mean, this is now purely conjecture, but if you look at what's been happening with the hashtag over the past few months, it started off as something that's very nationalistic, talking a lot about the SANDF, talking a lot about lockdown and the way that we need to secure our borders and keep safe. And gradually it's built up this boogeyman blaming foreign nationals for various social ills. And politically, if a political party can step up and say, well, we've got the answer for this problem, we've got high unemployment, we've got a lack of service delivery, and all of this is as a result of foreign nationals. Here's our plan to get rid of foreign nationals. And some of the main parties that we've seen that fit that bill and also interact quite a lot with the Put South Africa First hashtag community is the Africa Transformation Movement, the People's Dialogue, and the Put South Africa First, I think it's just called South Africans First political party, which is a relatively small party that's quite vocal and quite present in this community. So if we had to start looking at specific actors and the motives and the kind of the objectives of this campaign, it's undoubtedly political. It's just a question of identifying who and to what end they're trying to push these political campaigns.
Right. Stuart, would you like to have a go at that?
Yeah, I think there are a few things here. The first is we've been monitoring mis and disinformation around COVID right through the lockdown since March. And one of our mandates is social cohesion. So we were preemptively monitoring xenophobia, which is how we started picking this up, and then picking up the networked nature of it. We also saw this in the COVID disinformation, and we are part of a global social media community, as well as being separate and South African. And what has been going on in the States over the last 4 years under Trump has had a profound impact on our social media conversation, and I would argue on the way many South Africans see both the world and themselves. Jean has mentioned the level of nationalism that's been involved in this conversation and the political ends for which that has been picked up. This comes off the back of all sorts of conspiracy theories that have come through around COVID, which has culminated in what we're calling this the fourth wave of disinformation around COVID, which is around personal agency, which is mask wearing, social distancing. And in response, we've seen questioning of masks as a useful implement or a useful tool, of course, right from Trump all the way down into our social media, the pandemic kind of conversations that have gone on and so on. This has fed a nationalist agenda, global nationalist agenda, that's being picked up by right-wing elements effectively around the world. And in South Africa, that is translated into the xenophobic, the xenophobic attacks effectively, or the xenophobic community that has grown on social media. Politically, what we see is that the EFF and the ANC are avowedly anti-xenophobic, and that has opened up political space for particularly young, disaffected Black South Africans who are disproportionately the victims of unemployment and inequality. And small political parties, we assume in the run-up to the elections next year, and this is why we're running a program called Defending Democracy for next year that looks at all sorts of different narratives that could be affected by this. These political parties in a municipal kind of context, picking up a few votes here or there can be the difference between being a kingmaker and being completely irrelevant. And so we have seen Mario Khumalo from South Africans First very prominently associated with this network. We're assuming there's a hidden hand behind it, and that one of these political parties potentially is that hidden hand. African Transformation Movement, as Jean has mentioned, and Herman Mashaba, who quite comically had a taxi, about halfway through this, I don't know, June or so, I'm guessing, but he was associated right from the start. He actually put South Africans First on a taxi and put it on his Twitter page. I'm not sure if it was photoshopped on or not. And the network immediately disavowed him. They said, don't steal our thunder, don't take our hashtag away. And since then, there's been a bit of a distance between him and the network. But there are these overtly xenophobic, however they like to frame it, overtly xenophobic politicians going around grabbing votes, and they're using this kind of tactic in order to do so. And it's out of that Trumpian kind of playbook. These people are not interested in actual truth. It's all about identity politics, and it's all about emotive politics, and it's about blame and shifting blame onto minority communities effectively. And so in that sense, it's political, it's dangerous, and it's likely to get worse.
All right, we do have a question, but before I go to the question, I think it's an interesting one, basically, some of the issues that you've raised, John. So I'll give you an opportunity to answer, but I do want to please get us to talk about this. I did ask earlier on if there is a gender dynamics to any of these trends that we're seeing, whether it's xenophobic or racism. Chanel, have you found any such evidence, and is it overt?
Thank you. It's not always overt, but absolutely very often there's intersecting forms of prejudice. So we see pockets of prejudice, and it might start, with racism, and it might even be, for example, a blog on YouTube, that's hosted there, and then in the comment sections, it becomes a free-for-all. And so, for example, if it is a woman on the video that's included in a vlog, once you go to the comment section, it will be, oh, well, no wonder she's not married, what an ugly bitch. When she's talking about, for example, land redistribution. So we certainly see time and time again that race and gender, ethnic origin and gender, or gender identity or expression, they firmly intertwined. And we've got official statistics that show us, as Stuart mentioned, that Black African women are the worst off in our society. And then when you look at other forms of discrimination, for example, sexual orientation or gender identity, you've got this trifecta of grounds for prejudice, even if it's not crossing a legal threshold for discrimination or hate speech or harassment, whatever the case might be. It is deeply ingrained prejudice that goes against our constitutional foundational values of equality, dignity, and freedom. So absolutely, and I can't unfortunately speak to any live complaints being dealt with by the Commission, but even on social media, when we see the stoking of racial tensions, there is certainly, and the poster might not be aware of it, but there is certainly prejudice based on gender. And as we're trying to mitigate both the COVID pandemic and the gender-based violence pandemic, this is hugely problematic. And it's just a spiral or vicious circle, or whatever you want to call it, of economic inequality, which goes to status inequality. And these members of society, and they are part of our society, and they also have rights, but their prejudice certainly overlaps and serves to escalate and just spiral into multiple forms of discrimination and prejudice. And gender non-binary or lesbian African women are certainly bearing the brunt of prejudice in our society. And if they're non-national as well, then that's an additional ground.
No, thank you so much for that, Chanel. So we are open now for questions and answers. Cindy Sontlabati saying to you, Jean, have you been to a public hospital? And I think this is in reference to some of the disinformation campaigns that we were speaking about. And I saw actually earlier on, he had written that WMC is a thing though. So, I mean, it's about obviously separating fact from fiction and how we use those facts to create fiction. Jean?
Yes, indeed. I mean, this is not the first time I've been asked that question, specifically around the Ulur investigation. Most of it seems to be a way to try and delegitimize the research we've done. There is service delivery issues. That's not what's being discussed, and that's not what the point of our research was. Our research didn't show that, you know, the issues being complained about are not there. Public hospitals are understaffed, they are under-resourced. People aren't getting the kind of service that we'd like to see them get, you know, 2 decades after democracy. What we are seeing is that there are lots of issues that lead up to that kind of lack of service delivery. I've been on the investigative side with that while I was still with the public protector, investigating, you know, public institutions and seeing why they're not operating in the way that they should be. The fact that a public hospital is understaffed and that it's not doing as well as it should doesn't necessarily mean that that is solely due to foreign nationals also making use of the facilities. And that's kind of where the crux of this comes into, is to understand that the presence of foreign nationals in the country doesn't mean that all of our services are now being overrun, that nothing is there left for South Africans to use as well. And that's kind of the general narrative that's being used by the xenophobic networks, is to pin the blame for the entire problem facing the system on foreign nationals. So I think just to answer his question shortly, yes, I've been there. My family members going to public hospitals, and I've actually investigated lack of service delivery at public institutions, and specifically public hospitals as well.
Mm. And Stuart, I suppose it goes down really to obviously the digital space being a microcosm of society and the real problems that exist. But it's how people obviously express themselves, as Chanel was saying earlier on. We don't really have the legal standards, or perhaps we don't understand the legal standards on how to use this tool. So would you like to comment on that? Because I think the question is, how do we remedy the situation? How do we prevent these things from happening?
I saw that question there, and there are a number of ways to do it, none of which is perfect. I mean, to put this in context, there was a study that came out recently that suggested that stated that the climate change denialism movement in America was funded by right-wing conservative groups to the tune of $1 billion a year. And that around $200 million of that finds its way onto social media every year. So that's the kind of money that you're up against just in the climate change conversation alone. There are, though, ways to do it. We are experimenting with a bunch of them, particularly around dialogue, which is around talking into that space, around publishing relentlessly on it. So doing the kind of work that we've done here, publishing as we've done in the media over and over and over again on it, and continue to do so to bring it to public account so that we're talking about it in a space like this. To adjudicate on hate speech, we've been using the Real 411 platform, which is fantastic, of Media Monitoring Africa. Just in the last week, because what we do is we proactively look for tweets that we think are hate speech or incitement to violence. We put them through the Real 411 system. And at the back end, we want to then take that with to authorities and work with people like Chanel to prosecute, if possible. I think a prosecution or two would probably put the cat amongst the pigeons, you know. And then the last leg of that, I think, is policy. And here we have regulation in the South African context, and then there's regulation on the American end of it all. And we have very different interpretations of what free speech is in America versus here. You know, we are far more on the side of the responsibility that comes with freedom of speech, where the Americans are far more on the side of just freedom of speech for the sake of it. And as a result, because we are trying to get Twitter to take down certain posts or certain people, they're following their American standards on that. And it's the kind of thing where we would like to take these 400 odd accounts that we've identified to Twitter themselves and advocate for them to take that down and to make that public as well, and to make that a global issue rather than just a South African xenophobic issue, because this is going on all over the world. There's absolutely no, there's no question of that. I mean, there have been really, really frightening incidences of violence that have unfolded through disinformation campaigns on social media. So yeah, there are a whole bunch of different tools in the armory we're busy experimenting with. There are also your own bots. You can sort of respond in kind, and there are ways of using autoresponders and fact checkers on Twitter where you can actually go to source. And we're experimenting with this in the climate change space, is to actually say, you do realize you've just seen something that isn't true. Another really effective way, so before I shut up and hand back to someone else, is questioning into the space, because the thing with the xenophobic conversation that we note is that it's filled with statements. The statement is 80% of crime is committed by foreigners. The statement is 90% of farm murders are committed by foreigners. One statement was absurd. It was that Zimbabweans specialize in copper wire theft, and 100% of copper wire theft is done by Zimbabweans. Like there's a school somewhere that Zimbabweans go to. And that can be counted fairly easily with a simple questioning strategy, which is, where did you get those figures? I'm really interested in this. Can you point me to the source? Have you got a link? And if you start to fill that space through, this is something else that we do, is try and find anti-xenophobes. We're working on that in the misogyny space at the moment, misogynists on social media. And we're having great success at drawing them into programs, skilling them up, giving them the tools, all in the social media space, and then pointing them at a conversation and saying, go and do your work there. And if we can fill that space with enough questions, when people arrive in the space, it suddenly doesn't look as xenophobic as it does at the moment. You go onto the Put South Africans First hashtag, you go into those conversations, and you'll see a whole bunch of really clever and intelligent questions being asked by ordinary people. And that's the kind of way that we think we can affect change.
Right. Julian Sana from Carte Blanche, I hope your question has been answered. I think it has been quite comprehensively from what Stuart was saying there. Chanel, I'm going to come to you. An interesting point being raised by Tembis Botekele here, saying, what about the media? What role should we be playing in educating people? Saying that part of the problem seems to be how we just paint everyone with the same brush, irrespective of whether somebody is an illegal migrant or an illegal immigrant or an economic migrant or an asylum seeker. And it is true, I have found that people just generally don't understand, the differences between those labels. And they are indeed toxic if they're going to be used incorrectly. Chanel?
Thank you very much. And, as I started presenting, I mentioned the role of the media, and the media is essential for us as a society to get to a point of social cohesion. And the Human Rights Commission also relies, and especially now during COVID, relies a lot on media report to actually monitor both instances of prejudice and then those instances where there's an actual rights violation, so where it crosses some threshold. Now, terminology is very important. So perhaps instead of speaking about foreigners, we can speak about non-nationals. Instead of speaking about illegal immigrants, we can speak about people with irregular migration status. So that type of terminology shift is already very important. And then when the media reports on this, maybe just to give some context. So for example, the very public shortcomings of Department of Home Affairs in terms of backlogs, both in terms of applications for asylum seekers and refugees, and then, just actually getting the documentation to the people. That's a huge issue, and it contributes to the state of discontent and competition we see amongst the poor in the migration space. Also to note, for example, that economic migrants bring with them benefits. And then, as you've mentioned, certain political parties like the EFF have been very vocal against xenophobia particularly, and to also just draw those links between us as Africans, to get rid of this Afrophobia that we see crystallizing so clearly. And the answer is probably not, as some statements would say, to find a different enemy within our society, to rather just see poverty and inequality as the enemy, and then work together. So yes, so terminology, and then maybe just a little bit more contextual reporting. What are the main issues for migrants in our countries? When do you lose human rights? Because certain human rights you can't lose. So even if you are a migrant with an irregular migration status, you still have the right to human dignity. You still have the right not to be discriminated against unfairly, as opposed to fairly, for example, with jobs or whatever the case might be. And whereas other rights can be limited, like social security. And during lockdown, the Scalabrini Centre of Cape Town litigated on the right to food for refugees and asylum seekers. And they were successful in that litigation. Unfortunately, a question that I did not see asked is, is it justifiable to limit the right to food for migrants with irregular migration status during a global pandemic and a national lockdown, when people are essentially trapped within the border? So to have context and to be aware that certain rights adhere to humans for being human, and your migration status plays no role in that. And then also to note the structural issues migrants are faced with every day in this country.
Thanks so much for that, Chanel. There was a question that, and unfortunately, just as I was reading it, I think it's from John Borman, about shutting down the online noise. And I think it was also making a point about whether or not this online noise translates into actual on-the-ground support. So it was both you, Stuart, and Jean. I'm going to come to you, Jean, to answer that question, just to let everybody else know that we are wrapping up, but please put your questions in the Q&A section if you have something to ask before we wrap. Jean?
Yeah, see, Stuart has answered the question in the Q&A, and as he mentions there is a difference between what's happening on social media and what's actually happening on the ground. What's quite interesting with the Put South Africa First, the hashtags themselves get quite a lot of traction, and they're widely shared. They tend to trend quite early in the mornings, and they get a lot of traction on social media. But the moment it tries to translate into an actual protest on the street, or where people gather in person, there seems to be a lot less traction for that. Some of the photographs that we've seen circulated on the WhatsApp groups, for example, shows there's sometimes only 3 or 4 people attending some of these gatherings with their banners, and it's in a way kind of comical, because they need to take turns to hold the poster up while the other one takes the photograph. So there's not a lot. The social media doesn't actually translate into a lot of traction in person, on the ground. And what they've actually been doing to kind of get the numbers to swell up, I see Jan mentioned a number of 50 people for the first protest and 100 people at the second one. There's actually, it's not just the Put South Africans First people that are there protesting. They tend to co-opt and use other protests that are ongoing as well. So you'd find that there's actually 3 or 4, sometimes even 5 organizations there representing a totality of 100 people. But each of them is there for their own kind of angle on the Put South Africa First topic. A good example of this was unemployed graduates who marched a bit earlier this year. I saw quite a few of the Put South Africa First influencers sharing videos of the Mkhonto we Sizwe members marching in Durban earlier this month. And all of that was used to say, well, oh, look, people are taking to the streets. They kind of co-opt the actual on-the-ground protests, the successful ones, but their own protest doesn't seem like they're getting too much traction on the ground.
Right, and just a quick one while I have you there, Jean, because there is a question from Juliana Bland, because obviously we all know about Lerato Pillay because of the kind of comments that have come from that Twitter account. But the question is, how do you really find out who's behind these accounts? And I think for me, most importantly, how they're able to obscure their identity for long enough to be able to cause damage.
Yeah, I mean, we try and do our investigations and publish our work in such a way that you can follow how we came to that conclusion. In the Lerato Pillay account, for example, there specifically, the biggest thing was actually that we managed to profile him through his tweets. He was tweeting a lot about the SANDF. He tweeted quite a lot about some of the challenges facing a handful of soldiers that were repatriated out of the Congo in 2015. There was a lot of the old tweets that we could find where he specifically mentioned his place of residence. There was a particular military base that he mentioned once or twice in his tweets as well. So all of that kind of ties together. It's on their own, it's not enough to conclusively say who the person behind the account is. But the moment that you've got 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 of these little coincidences, they all tie together to make this web, which allows you to conclusively say, or at least with a lot of confidence say, that this is the individual running these accounts. A similar thing was with the Tracy Zilla account, where the links were drawn back all the way through to a specific individual who was running about, I think it's 4 or 5 of the websites that these network of accounts were linking back to. And all of that was for commercial gain, and the only person that stood to benefit would, by the logical conclusion, be the owner of that website. So it depends from one case to the next, but we've got various ways of doing that, and it's all just open source, digging around, finding clues, and then following up on them.
Stuart, in your research, what have you found? And I think ultimately it does draw back the discussion to how do we put an end to this practice?
Yeah, we focus on networks, and we focus on multiple narratives, and we focus on impact and ways to affect change. I've spoken about some of those. We also work with influencers ourselves to seed alternative narratives. So part of what our job, I think, as progressives is to come up with a better story. I think the right, and I'm speaking globally here, has for decades now been seeding identity politics into global politics, and it's now burst out into the open so successfully with people like Trump and Bolsonaro and various others. So yeah, the work is there to be done. We need to reframe the story. We're looking at multiple narratives. We're worried next year about the integrity of the IEC being questioned, for example. That's the kind of disinformation that can result in people contesting elections or saying that elections are not free and fair, like we expect Trump to do with the mail-in votes. The same sort of playbook is likely to be followed here. So these are the things that we're watching out for. Disinformation in South Africa, when it comes, I see the question from Ria about the Russians. We've got some fascinating material on what the Russians did in the American election, but also on what Trump did, and how divisive that campaign was. This is similar to that, but it's being done by really, really small political parties with tiny budgets. It's not like the ANC and the DA and the EFF all weighing in on this. And so, that concern isn't here with this xenophobia campaign. But if you want to look in the nuclear narrative and look for disinformation, that's another story, because their global money is involved. And so, energy futures, that's the area of contestation. If you want to look at WMC versus radical economic transformation, how corruption is hidden and justified, that's where other forces are waging disinformation campaigns. And again, it's about identifying it, publishing it, talking about it, exposing it, and talking back into it. That's all we have, really.
All right, thanks. Chanel, you spoke earlier on about the National Action Plan, and I'm quite interested to know if there are any particular gaps that you yourself have noted, not only in the policy, but even in the plans for implementation.
Wow. So it was only finalized last year, and I think the fact that it actually got finalized after, I think, 15 years or whatever, more than that, was a success in itself. There are certainly gaps. A huge issue for us, and it might not be so important for the person in the street facing this discrimination, but a huge issue is data, and what data do we have available? Because we can't hold anyone accountable if we don't have the correct and credible data to base it on. So that's an issue, and it's a very expensive. Data is an expensive issue if you have to disaggregate it and so forth. So that's certainly an issue. And then, as I mentioned already, implementation has already been hampered because of COVID and the ensuing lockdown. But I think as government deals with it, government will say it's not government's national action plan; it's every person in South Africa's national action plan. And certainly, the Commission and the media needs to popularize that plan. But no plan on paper is going to be a panacea for what we're seeing, and to remember that it's racism and xenophobia, unfortunately, that we're seeing, and it's different conversations that we have to have. But despite the difficulty and the emotive nature of these conversations, we have to have them. So we have to have with South Africans and non-nationals the conversation about unemployment in this country and what the drivers and factors are, and whether we can blame it on this tiny percentage of non-nationals in the country. And then on other emotive issues that seem to spark racism, like land reform. We need those people in a room. We need to be able to explain to them why land is central to dignity and how it's also symbolic of the hundreds of years of oppression faced by Black people in this country. And maybe if we can have these difficult, and there will be emotive conversations in a safe space, but difficult conversations, we can move on and we can start to reconcile. But it's just very important to keep the engagements going and not to see the alternative to xenophobia and racism online as censorship. So to rather these types of engagements, but maybe more focused on the issues we see arising because they are different.
Well, thanks to all of you. I'd like to give you all 30 seconds to say, we have examples like the Black Lives Matters movement, which I think there's a lot to learn from it. So if we're going to build a solidarity movement in South Africa, what are the lessons that we could learn from some of these international best practices? Chanel, I'll start with you, and your 30 seconds now.
All right, thank you. So, if we take Black Lives Matter, we see tragically that in South Africa, we also had people on the All Lives Matter bandwagon, and even the Colored Lives Matter bandwagon. So we are a deeply fractured society. And unfortunately, this fracturing engineered by the apartheid government has divided us. So we need, and again, it's only dialogue and education that's going to take us past this impasse, so that the more privileged members of our society can understand why that narrative is not going to take us anywhere better, and certainly not towards the objectives envisaged in our Constitution.
Thanks, Chanel. Jean, your 30 seconds.
Yeah, sure. With any kind of movement, something such as Black Lives Matters in the US, you've got the Antifa campaigns. All of these topics have got some form of polarization underscoring them. It always becomes something that's an us versus them. It's the BLM protesters versus the anti-BLM protesters. And wherever you find that kind of polarization in a society, that's where you'll find a fertile ground for a disinformation campaign to run. And South Africa is no different. With our levels of inequality, with all of our societal ills, with the legacy of apartheid still haunting us, you've got very, very fertile ground for people to step in there and use each of a number of topics to try and drive a specific agenda, to drive a specific narrative. And that's kind of the dangers that we need to look out for. We need to understand when we're being manipulated, how we're being manipulated, and at the end of the day, to understand that we are being manipulated and to think twice and even thrice before we click that share button.
Thank you so much, John. Stuart?
Well said, John. Yeah, I think it's really important to remember that there's a bell curve in any conversation. That's the natural nature of a conversation. We've done work on extremism, on Boko Haram, on Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, on Al-Shabaab, and there's a tendency in the world today to be centrifuging out to the extremes, and we see that on social media as well. Narrative manipulation often seeks to extremify both extremes. Often it will actually target both people. So the Russian campaign for Trump targeted Black American voters, trying to stop them from voting for Hillary Clinton. It was a you should be more radical message, and it was targeting right-wing Republicans at the same time to push the extremes into the center. It's when the extremes become mainstream that it gets really, really challenging and we're in trouble. And, you know, it's perfectly normal people are now talking about building a wall on the Mexican border. We're having, you know, in the Trump context again. And that's what we're a danger of, is the extremes being being pushed into the center until they become part of mainstream discourse. We need to guard against that. There are actors at play that are trying to extremify us, and where we see it, we need to be really careful of it. And I do think, to Chanel's point, that's about dialogue, and to Jean's point, it's about creating more conscious social media users. That would be my 30 seconds.
Thank you so much to all of you. Very fascinating discussion. Stuart Jones from the Center for Analytical and Behavioral Change. Thank you very much to you, Chanel van der Berg, Senior Researcher of Equality at the South African Human Rights Commission. Jean Leroux is from Digital Forensics Research Laboratory, and we've been talking about grappling with the rift of race and xenophobia in South Africa. I'd say quite a lot to glean from the panelists, and thanks to the participants as well. So this is the end of this discussion. We're going to get ready to get into the second part of the discussion with Daria Miller, who's going to give us a 101 course on how to understand what hate speech is. So first of all, let's start with a quiz. I think it'll give us all a fair idea of whether we know what hate speech is. Okay, so I'm going to ask that we launch that now. There we go. Okay, so you just pick an answer, and we're going to run a quick poll, and we'll see how we all perform at the end of this. Okay, so I think we're going to allow you to continue voting, but let me just then move on to the next section. Let's introduce Dario Miller, who is from Weber Wendell. So he's going to give us the lowdown, a beginner's guide, so to speak, to hate speech. And of course, the whole point of this is to help us understand what the recent constitutional court case was about, and when does racism and xenophobia become hate speech. So Dario, may I please hand over to you?
Thank you very much, Tapiso, and thank you to MMA for the invitation to speak to everyone. It's an honor to be here. I'm going to try to share my screen because I have prepared a presentation. Is it showing on your side, Tapiso?
Yep, I can see it.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. I've been given the rather unenviable task by MMA of giving a beginner's guide to hate speech. And I should add there, by the way, hate speech law, not hate speech. I'm certainly not going to teach anyone how to engage in hate speech. But I am going to try and go through the basics and break it down in terms of the South African position on hate speech law. Trying to unpack the basics doesn't mean to suggest that it's an easy area. It's a very difficult area of law. It involves deep questions of policy, philosophy, and the attitude that your particular country might take to freedom of expression. So different countries have different ways in which they regulate hate speech and the limits on free speech. But I'm going to take you through some of the South African provisions. And I might add, as Tapiso mentioned at the outset, that a lot of this is up in the air because of the recent constitutional court hearing in the Kwalani case, which we will come back to in the course of this presentation. I want to start with what I call a geography of hate speech. If you wanted to look for the legal sources of hate speech, where would you find them? Where would you find laws that deal with hate speech in South Africa? Of course, you'd find discussion of hate speech in the Constitution, Section 16.2, and you'd find it in Section 10 of PEPUDA, the Equality Act, the Promotion of Equality and Prevention of Unfair Discrimination Act. And I've highlighted those two in red because those are the two major sources of our hate speech law. And those are the two that I'm going to focus on in the 20 minutes or so that we've got together to discuss this. But that's not to say that those are the only two sources of law on hate speech. You will also find hate speech regulated in the Films and Publications Act. There are certain publications, films, and games that will be prohibited from distribution if they contain hate speech as defined in that act. There are provisions in the BCCSA code, which is the code that regulates broadcasters in relation to hate speech. Similarly, in the press code, the code that regulates print and online media. And it was mentioned earlier as well by Chanel that there is a bill floating around, the Prevention and Combating of Hate Crimes and Hate Speech Bill, which has been around since about 2018, not yet a law, but it will deal with hate speech as well, and indeed has a fairly extensive list of prohibited grounds, which we'll come to in other contexts shortly. And then don't forget, of course, that there is also a well-developed common law of criminal injuria at the criminal level and breach of dignity or injuria at the civil level, which can deal with, amongst other things, insults on, for instance, racial grounds or other discriminatory grounds. And so we have lots of law where people have been found criminally and civilly liable for uttering racist comments, for example, which may or may not amount to hate speech in terms of the other definitions, but there is an existing body of law which rightly deals with those kinds of offenses. And to give a fairly contemporary example, Vicky Momberg was sentenced to 3 years imprisonment with 1 year suspended, so effectively 2 years imprisonment for her shameful racist tirade a few years ago, which was very well publicized. And so at the heart of all of this, and we'll focus, as I say, on the Constitution and on Papuda, is the balancing that must take place. As in most areas of free speech law, we don't believe in absolute free speech in South Africa, and there are very few countries that do. There are lots of legitimate restrictions on free speech, and hate speech is one of those restrictions. At a principled level, we have taken the decision rightly, given our history, that hate speech qualifies as a legitimate restriction on freedom of speech in principle. That's the broad proposition, but of course, as always in law, the devil is in the detail. And the immediate question that is triggered is, well, what constitutes hate speech? And that's what we're going to look at in the course of the next few slides. So if we start with the Constitution, Section 16 is the provision in 1 which grants freedom of expression to everyone. Everyone has the right to freedom of expression. And then it includes a whole bunch of sub-paragraphs like freedom of the press. But look at subsection 2. It says the right in subsection 1, in other words, the freedom of expression right, does not extend to, and then the one that is relevant for present purposes, advocacy of hatred that is based on, and here there are 4 grounds, 4 prohibited grounds in the Constitution: race, ethnicity, gender, or religion, and that constitutes incitement to cause harm. And all that phraseology taken together, the shorthand for that in terms of the Constitution is hate speech. So we often say Section 16(2) excludes from the ambit of hate speech, of freedom of speech, that which we call hate speech as defined in the Constitution. And it's got those 3 elements. It's got to be an advocacy of hatred. Secondly, based on one of those 4 grounds: race, ethnicity, gender, or religion. Those were the 4 that were singled out by the drafters of our Constitution. And so there's a cumulative requirement. And the 3rd element, it must constitute, the advocacy of hatred must constitute incitement to cause harm. So that's how the Constitution defines hate speech. Now, I want to pause here because there is some confusion, even sometimes at the appellate level, on what Section 16(2) actually does. What is its legal force? What is the legal force and effect of Section 16(2)? One thing it doesn't do is it doesn't create a civil wrong or a crime. It doesn't say that if you breach Section 16(2), you have committed a delict or a statutory offense or a crime. All it does is it says, we are the Bill of Rights, we are articulating what those rights are, and one of those rights is freedom of expression, but we're cutting out, we're excluding from the right that gets protected of freedom of expression, hate speech as defined in the Constitution. And that's a pretty radical thing for a Constitution to do, to say we're taking out even of the limitations analysis, which we do with freedom of expression in other contexts like defamation and privacy, national security, commercial speech. We look at those restrictions and we balance them against freedom of expression through the lens of the limitations analysis, the limitations clause. Is it reasonable and justifiable, et cetera, et cetera. But the drafters say, yeah, there's no need even to go to the limitations clause in the Constitution, Section 36. Don't even go there. If you're dealing with speech that advocates hatred based on race, ethnicity, gender, or religion, and it constitutes incitement to cause harm, it's not covered. It's an internal limitation on the right to freedom of expression. But it's not a crime to breach Section 16(2). It's not a civil wrong. It's simply a way that the Constitution articulates the right broadly, but then cuts it down in those 3 respects, one of which is hate speech. In contrast to the fact that Section 16(2) is not, as I say, in itself a crime or a civil wrong, but merely a very important qualifier of the right to freedom of expression, you get the Equality Act, Papuda, which I'm coming to in a moment. But before that, it's helpful to understand and bear in mind in one of the early decisions of the Constitutional Court, Langer, the Deputy Chief Justice, Justice Langer, said when considering a case which involved an analogous area to hate speech, he said, there's no doubt that the state has a particular interest in regulating hate speech because of the harm it may pose to the constitutionally mandated objective of building a non-racist, non-sexist society based on human dignity and the achievement of equality. So there is a very powerful rationale for that carving out of the protection of freedom of expression, hate speech, and saying it doesn't qualify for protection. So that's the Constitution. We move on then to PEPUDA, which is a piece of legislation enacted pursuant to the Constitution, and particularly the Equality Clause, which says in Section 2 that hate speech is prohibited. But it defines hate speech in a different way to the way hate speech is defined in the Constitution. And so perhaps when you are doing your poll, one of the things you should be thinking is, am I being asked, is this hate speech in terms of Section 16.2's definition of hate speech? Or am I being asked, is this hate speech in terms of Section 10 of PEPUDA's definition of hate speech? And the bottom line is, PEPUDA is far broader than Section 16.2c. PEPUDA goes beyond the territory of 16.2c, and it catches within its net, in other words, more actions, more conduct that it classifies as hate speech than would be so classified under Section 16.2. Let's look at why. It's pretty broad. It says, subject to the proviso in Section 12, we'll come to that, no person may publish, propagate, advocate, or communicate based on one or more of the prohibited grounds, which we'll come to, against any person that could reasonably be demonstrate a clear intention to be hurtful, be harmful, or to incite harm, and I deliberately say and or there, to promote or propagate hatred. So it is a far broader definition of hate speech than Section 16.2. And as I say, it, for example, doesn't contain the limitation of advocacy of hatred. You don't have to advocate hatred. You have to publish or propagate or advocate. It's one of the options, words based on one or more of the prohibited grounds. Then the other big difference, of course, if you just look at what's on your screen, is that it's not just about hatred or about harm, inciting harm. Again, it's one of the options in Section 10, but it's also about words that could be reasonably construed as demonstrating a clear intention to be hurtful. And one of the big debates going on, and it's one of the big issues before the Constitutional Court, is how do you interpret A, B, and C of that definition? Are they what we call cumulative? In other words, do you need all of them? That speech has to be hurtful, harmful, and propagate or promote hatred for it to qualify as hate speech? Or is it disjunctive? In other words, the speech must be either hurtful or harmful or promote or propagate hatred in order for it to qualify as hate speech. And again, depending on how you answer that question, if you answer it disjunctively, you broaden the net of liability for hate speech even further. If you answer it in a way that says all three of those requirements are required, conjunctively, you narrow the net of liability. And it's one of the issues before the Constitutional Court. So two big differences so far. It doesn't only encapsulate the advocacy of hatred, but just the publication of words based on one of the prohibited grounds. Secondly, it doesn't only go to incitement of harm. There's a broader provision, hurtful, harmful, or promoting or propagating hatred. Thirdly, and this is something that we will see in the next slide, despite Section 12, is that under PEPUDA, there are 17 grounds. Sorry, I'm going too fast here. There are 17 grounds, prohibited grounds, under PEPUDA that apply. It's not just the 4 grounds in Section 16.2c of the Constitution. but 17 grounds, including, for example, sexual orientation, age, and so on. And those 17 grounds are all a part of what we would consider under PEPUDA to be hate speech if the other requirements are met. And the final difference I'd point out, of course, is this quite vaguely phrased requirement of intention, that the words must demonstrate a clear intention to be either one of those three things. And again, that's something that has caused the courts quite a bit of difficulty in recent cases. Remember, it says subject to section 12. So the other important point at the level of principle is that although it's a very broad net in section 10, it doesn't cover bona fide engagement in artistic creativity, academic and scientific inquiry, fair and accurate reporting in the public interest, or publishing any information in accordance with section 16 of the Constitution. The last exclusion is circular, because it goes back to what does section 16 of the Constitution prohibit. So that's caused some problems, but the others are fairly straightforward. And an example on fair and accurate reporting would be that if the media report on the hate speech of another, if the media are reporting, for example, on the recent allegations that Shoot the Boer was sung at the Senegal protests, that reportage by the media, even though you are, for example, including videos of the alleged hate speech, the reporting would not constitute hate speech because it's fair and accurate reporting in the public interest. And obviously we do need that kind of exclusion because context is everything with hate speech, and that's a point that I'll emphasize as we develop the slides. So just to summarize, 16.2, 3 requirements. Section 10, on the other hand, far broader definition. As I said, in particular, one of the big debates is it even broader than at first blush, where you have hurtful, harmful, and propagating hatred, or is it hurtful, harmful, or propagating hatred, with the latter obviously extending the definition even further. And that's a deliberate question mark there, as I say, because that's up for grabs in the Constitutional Court cases, which I'm coming to. So PEPUDA is broader, as I say, and there are those other grounds, other 13 grounds, in addition to the 4 grounds in the Constitution. So a very broad list. And I might add that the bill, the 2018 bill, even adds further grounds. So the hate speech and hate crimes bill would add further grounds that constitute prohibited grounds. PEPUDA is broader, and under PEPUDA, the Equality Court can grant a number of remedies, and they're fairly creative remedies. It's fairly extensive relief that can be granted by the Equality Court that is created by the PEPUDA, by Equality Act. Damages, a declaratory order, an interdict to stop the hate speech, an apology, and if a crime has potentially been committed, a referral to the NDPP. So PEPUDA creates that regime. And when we then look at some of the cases that have been decided, and I've emphasized 4 cases, all of which I was involved in usually for an amicus and typically for Media Monitoring Africa, actually. But these 4 cases help us understand what PEPUDA is all about and why potentially there might be some difficulties with PEPUDA when you look at the constitutionality of it. The first one was the apartheid flag case. And there I acted for the Human Rights Commission. We, with the Nelson Mandela Foundation, brought an application against AfriForum, and it all related to the 2017 march that was protesting farm murders. And at that march, where AfriForum played a very prominent role, there was displays of the apartheid flag by some of the members some of the protesters who were, quite openly and apparently without feeling any shame about it whatsoever, brandishing the apartheid flag. So the application was brought to declare displays of the apartheid flag that are gratuitous, in other words, that don't comply with that exemption that I spoke about. The application was, in terms of the Equality Act, to declare those kinds of displays of the apartheid flag to be hate speech under PEPUDA. It's a PEPUDA case. And to interdict further displays of the apartheid flag. And I'm pleased to say that Deputy Judge President Mojapelo found in favor of the applicants that the apartheid flag, displaying the apartheid flag in that gratuitous way, would constitute hate speech under Papuda. It's on appeal to the Supreme Court of Appeal, and everything is in limbo pending the Constitutional Court's decision in the Kwelane case, which I'll come to shortly, because the Kwelane case actually deals with Section 10 and its constitutionality, and what the Constitutional Court might say about Section 10 will affect all these other cases as well. But let's just unpack what Mojapelo said. Firstly, interestingly, he said, well, the apartheid flag, when you are displaying the apartheid flag, you are not communicating words, you are displaying a flag. And of course, as you know, Section 10 refers to words specifically. Yet Judge Mojapelo accepted our argument and the Nelson Mandela Foundation's argument that in context, words here, the meaning of the word words, actually is words as well as other non-verbal action, such as waving a flag. Waving a flag, of course, is symbolic speech. You are saying something by displaying the flag. It's expression. And the court said that just because the legislation says words, it doesn't necessarily only mean words. And in law, it can sometimes happen that black means white, that and means or, and as we've seen here, that words means words and something else, potentially. So that's the first thing. The second thing is clearly this was on a prohibited ground. The flag visually communicates a message of white supremacy and racism, as the court rightly said, which harms the dignity of the black population. And the intention, says the court, was in fact to incite and awaken feelings of white supremacy against black people, to hurt, harm, and incite hatred, and it demeans and dehumanizes people on the basis of race. So quite a resounding finding that the display of the apartheid flag gratuitously would constitute hate speech. A word on context here as well. If the apartheid flag is being displayed in the Apartheid Museum in the context of a reminder of the horrors of our past, that of course would not constitute hate speech, because that is a context that would qualify under the Section 12 exemption. But waving the flag as you are protesting murders in that particular context, and frankly, in most other contexts, it's very hard to think of contexts where waving the apartheid flag would be legitimate, is now regarded as hate speech pending the appeal of AfriForum once the Kwelane judgment is in. The other case and there's a handful of hate speech cases. The other case that's quite interesting is the Shoot the Boer case, where again, AfriForum was involved in this case against Malema and the ANC. Julius Malema was then still a member of the ANC and of course, the president of the ANC Youth League. And what this case concerned, it concerned in 2010, Malema's singing of the Shoot the Boer struggle song in a number of contexts, mainly at speeches and rallies that were held by Malema at the University of Johannesburg, in Mafeking and in Rustenburg, and also his singing of the song in Polokwane at one of his birthday parties. And again, that context is important. You know, singing the struggle song in the shower or at your birthday party to your select guests might be very, very different to singing the song in a politically charged rally. So context is everything. And in quite a, with respect, rambling judgment, I think, of the High Court, of the Equality Court. Incidentally, this was also one of the first cases that was televised live, because both the ANC and Malema and AfriForum agreed to it. It was televised live. But in a fairly rambling judgment, the judge concluded that this was hate speech. The singing of the struggle song was hate speech. And he said that, if you look at the slide, Malema communicated and published words which could reasonably be construed to demonstrate an intention to be hurtful, incite harm, and promote hatred against the white Afrikaans-speaking community, including the farmers who belong to that group. It was part of the context that when Malema sang the song, he also made gestures of a gun while he was dancing and singing the song. So that obviously comes into the analysis. But unfortunately, not very rigorous, in my view, discussion by the judge of the various elements of Papuda, of Section 10 in Papuda. Why was this inciting harm, promoting hatred, etc.? Was it hurtful? You may well agree with the decision on the facts, but from a legal perspective, one would have wanted a little bit more analysis. Incidentally, the decision was appealed by the African National Congress and AfriForum, and we then acted for one of the amicus who also were entering the case at the Supreme Court of Appeal level. But the appeal was withdrawn when the parties, the ANC and AfriForum, publicly settled the matter through a mediation where the song would not be sung except on occasions where it was commemorating the historic credentials of the song as a struggle song, and not in a political rally context, etc. So it never got to the Supreme Court of Appeal, perhaps unfortunately from a jurisprudential perspective. Two other cases, and these are the two cases before the Constitutional Court. The one is about Bongani Masuku. And Bongani Masuku, this case, and both these cases rather disappointingly go back over a decade. In Masuku, the relevant words were spoken in 2009, and the case is only now before the Constitutional Court. It was argued last year. We acted there for MMA as an amicus. And the Kwelani case, which is before the Constitutional Court, argued just a month ago, again, judgment reserved. That case emanates from an article that was printed in 2008. So these are cases that have been very long in the tooth and have gone through various stages of the legal process. Let's start with Masuku. This is about Bongani Masuku, who was the secretary of one of the arms, I think the international relations arm of COSATU. And in 2009, when he uttered these words on a blog that you see in front of you, and then also made a speech, a highly charged speech at Wits University, the context was increased, of course, hostility in the Middle East. There had been attacks on Hamas, 700 people had died. And in that context, the South African Zionist Federation and the South African Jewish Board of Deputies had issued an open letter supporting Israel. And there were protests and demonstrations by those in South Africa who were against the Israeli position, including Mr. Masuku. He said on a blog, amongst other things, Jews who continue to stand up for Israel should not just be encouraged, but forced to leave South Africa. We must target them, expose them, and all that is needed to subject them to perpetual suffering until they withdraw from the land of others and stop their savage attacks on human dignity. And what this case is about is it's about whether the context of the words in the blog and at the two Wits University meetings were targeting, when he said this, whether Bongani Masuku was targeting Zionists or whether he was targeting Jewish people. Because if it was the former, being a political ideology, then the way the case was pleaded, it would not be hit by one of the prohibited grounds under Papuda. Whereas if his comments were undermining the dignity of Jewish people because they are Jewish, then that would be one of the prohibited grounds. And so, as you can see, the issue of the prohibited grounds are critically important. But beyond that factual matrix in the case, it was also important because what the Supreme Court of Appeal did there is the Supreme Court of Appeal said that the Human Rights Commission had abandoned its reliance on Papuda, the Equality Act, in that case, and instead were relying on Section 16.2. Now, that's quite puzzling at the level of legal principle because, as I was saying, 16.2 is a constitutional internal limitation, but not something that founds a cause of action in its own right. The Human Rights Commission can't use Section 16.2 to, for example, bring a case in the Equality Court against Mr. Masuku or Mr. Kwelani or AfriForum. They've got to found that complaint on the Equality Act, Section 10. And so it was quite puzzling that the Supreme Court of Appeal got into this issue of was Masuku's speech in contravention of Section 16.2 as opposed to Section 10 of the Equality Act. And of course, as we saw earlier, Section 16.2 is a much higher threshold. And so it wasn't surprising that if you're using 16.2 as the test, even aside from, is it targeting Jewish people or is it targeting Zionists? What the court said there is the bounds of constitutional protection are only overstepped where the speech involves incitement of imminent violence or advocacy of hatred based on race, etc. Nothing that Masuku wrote or said transgressed those boundaries, however hurtful or distasteful they may have seemed to members of the Jewish and wider community. Many may deplore them, but that does not deprive them of constitutional protection. So that's the kind of classic, I may not agree with what you say, but I will defend your right to say it. But it really threw the cat amongst the pigeons from a hate speech jurisprudence perspective, because what the Supreme Court of Appeal did there last year in 2018, it was before the Concord last year, is it effectively said we can bypass, admittedly it said this because the Human Rights Commission in the Supreme Court of Appeals view had abandoned the Equality Act, but what the SCA is saying, forget about Section 10, let's look at this case using the lens of Section 16.2. And in my view, that is the wrong way to go about it, because Section 10 is actually the heartland of hate speech. And it's Section 10, which regulates hate speech in South African law from a civil wrong perspective. So that's before the Constitutional Court was argued last year, and the Constitutional Court said they were going to first decide Kwelani before they decide the Masuku case, which makes sense, because Masuku is largely about the meaning of the words and whether it targets, to the reasonable observer, Jewish people or Zionists. It's not really about all the other nuanced issues that happened in the Kwelani case, which is the final case that I want to talk about to complete this picture of what current hate speech jurisprudence is all about in South Africa. And again, as I say, this dates back to 2008 when John Kwelani was a columnist at the Sunday Sun, and that article appeared in the Sunday Sun, as well as a cartoon. And the article is headed, "Call me names, but gay is not okay." And Mr. Kwelani, you can't obviously read the entire article on the screen, but what he effectively said there is, and this is sort of illustrated by the cartoon, even though the cartoon, it was Common Cause, was not something that he sanctioned. But what he effectively says, I'll quote from the article, just the choice bits, is he says, "The real problem is the rapid degradation of values and traditions. You regularly see men kissing other men in public, walking, holding hands, and shamelessly flaunting what are misleadingly termed their lifestyle and sexual preferences." And then he goes on to say, "Making me wonder what it is these people have against the natural order of things. Please tell the Human Rights Commission I totally refuse to withdraw or apologize for my views." Well, since 2008, he's remained true to that. He hasn't apologized for his views yet. "Homosexuals and their backers will call me names, printable or not, for stating, as I have always done, my reservations. But quite frankly, wrong is wrong. I don't give a damn. I pray that someday a bunch of politicians will muster the balls to rewrite the constitution of this country to excise those sections which give license to men marrying other men and ditto women. Otherwise, at this rate, how soon before some idiot demands to marry an animal and argues that this constitution allows it?" And that's, of course, what prompted the cartoon as well. Now, look, the Sunday Sun got into trouble, as one would expect, rightly, with the Press Council, and they were on the receiving end of a judgment or a ruling that said that they contravened the press code. Because remember, the press code would regulate hate speech that was published by the print media. And this isn't a case where, of course, the media could say this is a fair and accurate report of someone's hate speech, because they were publishing in an editorial capacity Mr. Kwelani's column, and they didn't edit it, they didn't reject it, they took a decision to publish it. So they settled with the Human Rights Commission, apologized, etc. But the Human Rights Commission still took on Mr. Kwelani, and it's been, of course, quite a long road since 2008. It finally got to the Supreme Court of Appeal last year, where the Supreme Court of Appeal declared Section 10 to be inconsistent with the Constitution. And what Judge Nafsa for the Supreme Court of Appeal says is effectively, he says, there are a number of problems, and he isn't very charitable about Section 10. He calls it barely intelligible, and he's not too far off the mark with respect. It is, in my view as well, a section that is very clumsily worded. But in the view of the Supreme Court of Appeal, you know, first of all, you've got to read Section 10 disjunctively. I was talking about that earlier, not conjunctively. That means you broaden the net even further. And what the Supreme Court of Appeal says is that you have to read it that way if you look at various textual indicators and other interpretive tools. So it's very broad. And that means you've got the problem of this regulating hurtful speech, publishing hurtful speech about one of those 17 prohibited grounds will constitute hate speech. And hurtful is, of course, very, very broad. And I think most of the litigants agreed that if it was just hurtful speech that was prohibited, there would be potentially a free speech problem. So that's the first thing. It includes hurtful speech, and that's why it's unconstitutional, says the Supreme Court of Appeal. Secondly, the test of intent that I was telling you about earlier, that it must demonstrate an intent to cause hurtful, harmful, or hateful speech. That itself is confusing because it's not an objective test, says the Supreme Court of Appeal, but a subjective test that includes hurtful, harmful, or propagating hatred. So that's the second problem, says the Supreme Court of Appeal. It did say that the extension of those 4 grounds in the Constitution to include sexual orientation was justifiable. So that is justifiable, and rightly so. But pretty much all the other elements of Section 10 were held by the Supreme Court of Appeal not to be consistent with the Constitution, declared unconstitutional. The order that Kwelani should apologize within 30 days was therefore removed, and the complaint was dismissed, and Parliament was given 18 months to cure this. In the interim, what the court said is, you know what we're going to do? We're going to suggest that Section 16(2)(c), the definition of hate speech in the Constitution, in the interim, while Parliament is fixing this, will be what hate speech under Papuda will also regulate. Now that is for confirmation, that is before the Constitutional Court, and as I say, argument took place virtually about a month ago, and the Constitutional Court will in due course hand down its decisions in both Kwelani and Masuku, which involves issues that follow on, particularly in terms of interpretation. It will also affect cases like the apartheid flag case, although I think the apartheid flag display is probably prohibited on all those grounds anyway. And so we wait to see what the Constitutional Court is going to say in that case, those cases. No doubt hate speech for beginners, if I do this again next year at this time, I'll be able to shed some light on that. But for now, let me just draw together some, as my final point, some guidance for now, subject to those decisions. Firstly, hate speech regulation is not limited to what is contained in Section 16(2) of the Constitution. Drafters of legislation can go further. They must go further, right? Because if they don't go further, for example, you don't have sexual orientation as a prohibited ground, and you are stuck with the 4 in the Constitution. So that itself is an indication that hate speech regulation has to extend beyond Section 16(2) of the Constitution. The question then is, when do you draw the line? How do you draw the line? And where do you stop that extension? It can, in my view, go beyond advocacy of hatred that constitutes incitement to cause harm, but it's got to be justified under the limitations clause. There has to be an assessment and an interrogation of whether the speech, whether the law complies with the limitations analysis. Hate speech under Papuda, of course, until the Constitutional Court clarifies. Let me give you my understanding of these particular provisions. As I say, it's not just words. We know that from the apartheid flag case, and although that's on appeal, I think it's absolutely correct that it should extend to non-verbal communication. Otherwise, the most racist cartoon, for example, would be allowed, and yet when you speak the words that the cartoon is suggesting, that would be prohibited. It would be completely absurd. It's based on one of those 17 prohibited grounds in Papuda. I think they are all worthy grounds to be in Papuda. I think it's an objective test, not a subjective test, as the Supreme Court of Appeal says in Kwelani. And I think that although it's very clumsily worded, you've got to ask yourself whether objectively viewed, the words used demonstrate an intention to be all of the requirements. In other words, it's a conjunctive interpretation, hurtful, and it's got to be harmful, and it's got to promote or propagate hatred. And the final point I'd say before ending is we all appear to agree in terms of the settled jurisprudence, and certainly in Kwelani, the Supreme Court of Appeal accepts this, that harmful is not limited to physical harm. It's not that if I cause physical harm to you as a member of the group that I am expressing hatred towards, that would only be covered. It's also if I'm going to cause you psychological or emotional harm. And I think that's absolutely right. Harm should not be limited to physical harm. It's got to be, which would be too easy for people then to escape liability. It's got to be extended to non-physical forms of harm as well. So that's me on the presentation, and I welcome any questions that might have been asked and discussion from other panelists. Thank you. I may have overstayed my welcome slightly, for which I apologize.
Well, it was an educational overstay, really, really interesting, insightful, because I must say I hadn't quite realized the application of the law in the manner that you have explained it. Thank you so much for that. Lots of worthwhile learning. Dario Miller, let me hand you over now to William Bird, the Media Monitoring Africa Director. I think he'll take over proceedings from here.
Oh, lovely. Thank you very much. Sorry, Ma, I was waiting for my video to switch on. Thank you very much, Riggs, for that excellent overview. It's slightly longer than our agreed thing, but for those who really wanted to get a really good grip of how our law works, I think that was such an invaluable input. So thank you very much. That was great. I really loved the discussion earlier, and I think that it's really come together in a fascinating way. So now people, I hope, can be aware of the various criteria and things that you might need to think of, and also understand just how difficult it is to deal with these things. You know, the first part of the conversation, we started off getting a sense of how bad things are and what constitutes them and who's behind it and how we identify and how we combat it. And now we get down to the real issues around legal, not the real issues, the legal side of it, to understand just how difficult it is to define these things, and also, you know, understanding some of our seminal hate speech cases. So I think that's really, really fascinating. If there are any questions, you can raise them there. Otherwise, what I'm going to do, I see that there's otherwise just generally lovely feedback. Thank you, Dario, lovely, useful presentation, great presentation, and great presentation. It was repeated by some of the others. What I'm going to do now then is, if we can put the poll results up on the screen, is that possible? My people, he says, in the hope that someone is listening to him, that we can put the results of the poll up on the screen, so that we can then run through quickly the answers to that, because we thought it would be a bit of fun to get people to think about what examples were there. And so Dario had very kindly sent through a few teasers just for everyone to have a look at. Okay, and there we go. There are the answers to questions 1 and 2. So we see that Donald Trump's tan makes him look like an overripe orange. Sometimes I'm a little more impolite than that. But you can see that broadly speaking, people said no, they did not believe that that was hate speech. And indeed, that is the correct answer. And the reason being is that it's not based on any of the prohibited grounds around advocating hatred. So it doesn't advocate hatred, and it's not on any of the prohibited grounds. You're not saying certain things about his race or identity or gender, for example, or even any of the other 15 others. You are saying that he looks like an overripe orange. So that's that's the answer to the first question. The second one, Donald Trump has COVID-19. Finally, something good happened in 2020. So again, this is fairly controversial, and in fact, it breached. People said Donald Trump has COVID-19. Finally, I hope he dies. People that wished him death, for example, depending on the social media platform, those posts were actually either demoted or in some instances removed. But it's not hate speech according to our criteria, because clearly it doesn't advocate hatred or incite harm. So it's not going and saying we hate all of Donald Trump's, he's a single person. And similarly, it's not saying we should all go and give him COVID or give others COVID. So that's why it doesn't meet that test. The third one, COVID-19 was caused by Chinese people and the weird foods they eat. They should be banished from society. Again, well done to the audience. Most of you got that spot on. Yes, that does constitute hate speech because it advocates hatred and it incites harm based on ethnicity or culture. So it's suggesting that Chinese people brought it, and it's saying that they should be banished from society. So it's clearly maligning them, making all sorts of other unfair and ethnically challenging comments based on the weird foods that they eat. So on that basis, that one clearly would tick the hate speech buttons. I'm rushing through these, I know, but I know we also over time. So there's each of these you could have fabulous discussions about. 4, LGBTQI plus community is spreading AIDS. We need another Orlando massacre. This one, thankfully, almost everyone said yes, this is hate speech. Again, it advocates hatred. It suggests that they're spreading HIV, and that we need another Orlando massacre, suggesting that people should be killed for that. Clearly ticks those boxes. Under 5, things were better under apartheid. This is one of those comments. Is it hate speech? Quite a number of you said yes, it is. And in fact, currently, no, it isn't, because it doesn't. It's not on the basis of a prohibited ground. It's saying something was better, but that it also doesn't advocate hatred or incite harm. So the mere idea that you are suggesting something about apartheid doesn't in fact mean that you are then advocating harm, or that you're actually inciting, advocating hatred or inciting harm. So controversial one, and you can see that because a lot of you thought, well, that really upsets and aggravates us, and I think it upsets and aggravates any sane, rational, democracy-loving human being, but it's not hate speech. Finally, abortion is murder. We should do the same to women who get one. That is clearly an example of hate speech under our current regulations. I mean, because it advocates hatred and incites harm based on gender and pregnancy. Pregnancy being another ground that's contained in the Papuda list of 17. So there you have your answers. In almost all instances, you were bang on with them. So well done to those that participated. I hope you found that interesting. I am going to allow, because there's still people there, if any of you have got a burning question for Dario, I think we will allow it. If you don't have a burning question, I'm going to thank our people and let everyone go. Okay, so I've got 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, so thank you, Zelda, for that. Okay, so right, I'm going to assume we've dealt with the questions. So it remains to me. So Piso, thank you so very much for your excellent facilitation and driving us and keeping us on time. Stuart, thank you very much. We're looking forward to some great participation and partnership as we rev and hurtle towards elections faster than we can possibly think. We really appreciate it, and thank you for all your hard work. Jean, please keep going. We know you are going to be attacked for it, for being evil and all manner of other things that I know you get accused of sometimes. Chanel, thank you very much for your hard work and dedication at our Human Rights Commission, and we're looking forward to affirming all of those arrangements up in the next couple of weeks. And Riggs, thank you very, very much for your excellent input there. It was well worth the additional time. I certainly thoroughly enjoyed it. So thanks, everyone. Remember our final event for this week. We're going to be looking at deepfakes, and that's going to be a workshop, how to unpack them, what to look for. It's going to be really cool, really good fun. And we've also got a lovely speaker from Africa Tech, and we've got one of our own fantastic people that'll be speaking on Friday. So Friday, 2 o'clock, please register, sign up for workshop unpacking deepfakes. So thanks very much, everyone. Have a good afternoon.
Thanks all. Bye-bye.